Hey YouTube, I'm Yukitsu, this is the Yukitsu Times. Welcome to my channel. Welcome to Total War Warhammer. And again, we're going to be talking about the factions sort of one by one. This one's going to be about the Dwarves. Now, the Dwarves are sort of an interesting faction in that they're a little bit limited, but they're not an incomplete roster at the current point in time. Now, they could do with some additions, but the way that they play, they have no cavalry whatsoever. And that's sort of just the way that the Dwarves are. And that includes their lords, who cannot be mounted on anything. So let's go through their roster pretty quickly because they've got a fairly large one. Now, the lord, the basic one, the general, is a melee one. And it's got a magic resistance of 25%. We're going to stop talking about that because all dwarves have it. It makes them a little bit less susceptible to magic being used against them, but it's not enough to stop general sniping, which I think is still going to be a bit of a problem to the game. Now, the Dwarven General is pretty beefy and pretty tough as his base statistics. He could take an Imperial one, for example, one-on-one, no problem, just because these ones are a little bit tougher than the default human one. It makes up for the fact that they don't have any sort of mounts, but they do pay for that additional stat line. So I don't particularly like the fact that they don't gain any additional sort of bonuses or anything like that. They just lose mount options for a small amount of stats that they have to pay for, so they're not really great value. Next up, you've got Ungrim Iron Fist. He is the same thing. He's a melee type lord. He's got Unbreakable as one of his traits, and he's got Death Blow as one of his traits. Unbreakable means that he'll never run from a fight. Death Blow means that he does additional damage, essentially, when he's on very low health. And he's got Charge Defense versus Large. Other than that, he's the same as a typical lord, although he does have an armor-piercing attack thanks to his great weapon, making him quite effective against armored targets, and he's all in all a pretty decent lord choice. He does pay a little bit for those abilities, but he's not that much more than a generic lord. Next is Thorgrim Grudgebearer. He has huge defensive statistics, huge amounts of hit points, meaning that he's hard to kill in melee combat, but he's just as easy to assassinate otherwise. He does have the High King ability, which is similar to Lowen Leoncor's ability. It's an aura that affects the entire army when you're on low health, low leadership rather, where you get plus 8 melee attack for all of your units, plus 4 charge bonus, and immune to psychology for all of your units, which is a pretty decent buff, but since you have to be on low leadership, it's hard to get him to low leadership, really. He's got such high leadership values that doesn't really happen that often for him. His weapon strength is very, very high. His melee attacks are magic, so he's a decent melee type lord, but again, ultimately he's a melee type lord. That just means that you're going to be using him in the same sort of context as you would any other melee lord. Run him into combat, hope that he does a lot of damage. He's not actually a armor-piercing general, but his armor-piercing damage is still quite high, so you can use him for that capacity. He's quite slow, a little bit slower even than the others, but that shouldn't really dissuade you from using him in that role. Just keep him in the middle of your army. But typically he's a bit too expensive for what he gets added to him. I prefer Ungrim Iron Fist. Next up, you've got the Thane. He's a generic melee type hero. Again, this isn't really a very good one because he doesn't have any mount options and just has a good stat line, but not anything stellar. He costs a little bit more than some of them, like the Imperial Captain, for example, or a Paladin, but he gets better stats than them as a result. You've got the Master Engineer next. Now, these guys are interesting. They've got a very reliable, decent missile damage attack. He's got good weapon strength with a decent armor-piercing amount, although it's lesser than the amount of basic damage than you get out of, for example, the Thane. So these guys are pretty decent damage dealers in and out of melee. They've got relatively okay stats all in all. They're not as good as the Thane in combat, but what they sort of have going for them is the extra powder aura, which gives you extra explosion damage, and it gives you the ballistics calibration, which gives you minus 16% reload time and plus 20% accuracy, which is actually a pretty decent bonus to your ranged units that you can activate. It lasts for 31 seconds and has a refresh period of 45 seconds, so it actually can be up most of the time. Next up, you've got the Runesmith, who's your supportive type. Now, this guy actually has statistics that are almost identical to a Thane in melee combat, and he's actually very, very good as a melee fighter. But his main benefit is the Forge Fire ability and his runes. Forge Fire is a constant aura that he gets. It gives you plus 4% armor-piercing damage for all units directly around him in a very, very, very short radius around him. And this is actually a fairly strong ability. I believe it does affect himself, which means that his damage actually ends up being on par with the Thane. But he does also have these other runes. The Rune of Negation. Now, it has a massive 90-second recharge rate, and it lasts only 10 seconds, but it does a massive 44% damage resistance bonus to all of the units in the radius around him, which is a huge amount of damage that you're soaking up with that ability for that 10 seconds. Next up, you've got the Rune of Oath and Steel, plus 15 armor, 13-second duration, much shorter cooldown, so it is fairly effective at keeping your units alive, but plus 15 armor is not a huge bonus, really. And then you've got the Rune of Wrath and Ruin, and it is a direct damage spell that you use on larger units. You don't use it against individual targets because it doesn't deal that much damage to them. This can deal a good amount of damage, softening up tougher units, but it's not necessarily as good as if you got an assassination ability like Q's that you got on the Witch Hunter. Now, the Runesmith does seem to cost a ton of points, but when you realize that he's just as good as the Thane with a bunch of abilities tacked on, he can actually be quite worth his while. Next up, you've got the infantry for dwarves, and you start off with the miners, which are quite a weak unit. They're kind of cheap. They've got relatively decent stat lines, but nothing too spectacular, and vanguard deployment. And you'll have to pardon my voice being a little bit off because I've got a sore throat and a mug of tea. So that's a lovely combination. Anyway, the miners have got an armor-piercing weapon, but they don't have the best damage ever, and they've got low melee attack and melee defense, meaning that they'll get chopped through by most units pretty effectively. And if they're not fighting armored units, they're not very good value, and if they are fighting armored units, most of them are elite enough that they'll beat miners quite handily. The vanguard deployment is risky with them as well, because typically they'll pop up somewhere and the enemy will just sort of be like, oh, well, it's an isolated dwarf unit, and then just surround it and destroy it very, very quickly. So vanguard deployment could be good against an opponent that's taking a lot of artillery. If they send their army forward away from their artillery for whatever reason, then your miners could potentially run out and start killing them, but that's very, very unlikely and situational. So I don't think that miners are particularly good for the dwarves. Miners with blasting charges, on the other hand, I think can be situationally quite good. They've got these lovely missile attacks that they can chuck out there that disrupt enemy charges, deal quite a lot of damage to them as well. They've only got one ammunition, however, so you kind of have to hope that that breaks up a charge really, really well. Once they've done that, they can join in melee and be relatively effective, joining in, for example, Dwarf Warriors. Now, you could use miners in addition to Dwarf Warriors, but like realistically, for only 75 points more, you get that blasting charge, which is actually quite good. Now, even then, I don't particularly like miners, just because they are so weak in melee. But the next unit, the Dwarf Warrior, a little bit more expensive than a miner, but they've got really, really good stat lines for a basic infantry type unit. Decent weapon strength and really good melee defense means that these guys are very, very solid, hard to break through. Now, this is something I'm not going to talk too much about because just assume any unit that is not using a great weapon has it, charged defense against large foes. This means that when they're standing still, dwarven units don't take very much damage against cavalry or other large monsters, and that is a fairly effective trait at stopping them from coming in and hitting you too hard. The problem is that this does not give them the ability to deal good damage to those large targets. It just means you're not going to be taking very much damage from them. So dwarves suffer a little bit in the anti-cavalry department in that they don't have very good dedicated anti-cavalry units. They just don't have them. The dwarf warrior, however, is a very good value prospect. With good armor, melee defense, they're hard to kill, and they're relatively cheap. There's the Dwarf Warrior with the great weapons. They sacrifice melee defense and are not really all that much better than the Dwarf Warriors in a lot of contexts, but they've got the armor-piercing attack. Personally, I find they don't beat very many of the armored units in this game because most of the armored units in this game are quite elite. So if we were to, for example, take a look at the Vampires roster, the only units that really are armored are the Graveguard and the Graveguard with great weapons, both of which are too elite for the regular Dwarf Warriors to really easily beat. In fact, Dwarf Warriors with great weapons will very, very solidly lose against the Graveguard with great weapon sort of fight. So honestly, I think that Dwarf Warriors with great weapons, not necessarily the best investment just because their stats are quite low, quite poor across the board. Now, they've got the Longbeards. These are upgraded Dwarf Warriors that have really good armor, leadership, and they've got an encourage aura and immune to psychology. So these guys are very, very tough. Their melee attack and melee defense are higher, their melee weapon strength is higher, so they're just all around better. And they don't cost too much more than a regular Dwarf Warrior unit for all that they're getting. These guys are very, very solid, but fill functionally the same role. Next up is the Longbeard with the great weapon. Now, these ones actually can do pretty well against things like Black Orcs or Graveguard with great weapons. Now, they're not as good as those units, but they're very, very close, and they've got a 750-point price tag, which is quite low, meaning that you're not paying a whole lot for a heavily armored unit that has good stats all around. And they have enough melee defense to still stick it out in a fight that's otherwise not really a great weapon reliant fight. So if they're fighting non-armored units, they can still do okay. Not as good as, for example, the regular Longbeards, and certainly not as economically as the regular Longbeards, but they still do okay in that situation. Next up, you've got the Slayers. These are dedicated anti-monster units. They have unbreakable morale, so they will never run from anything, and they've got the death blow ability, meaning that when they're low health, they do a lot more damage. Now, these guys, interestingly enough, have 0 armor, which is unique for dwarves, but they've actually got a fairly high amount of armor-piercing damage, meaning you could use these in theory to fight things that are heavily armored, like great swordsmen, for example, but I think they still lose in that particular fight just because of the great swords bonus versus infantry. Their generic damage being so high, though, as well as the bonus versus large, makes them effective anti-cavalry and very good monster hunters, which is what they're really supposed to be. Their movement speed isn't quite high enough to keep up with a lot of the monsters out there in this game, however, meaning they have some difficulty with those sorts of things. But otherwise, they're all in all a pretty solid unit for their particular niche. It's just that they are a niche unit that they may not end up using. They may not end up fighting the thing that they're supposed to be. Even then, they can be a solid unit all around. Next up are the Hammers, and these are probably the highest damage melee weapon users in the game. Like, they just have so much weapon strength for a full-size unit that they can just crack through any heavily armored unit in the game, as far as I'm aware of. I think they even beat Chosen with great weapons. Like, they've got huge weapon strength, really, really high melee attack, decent melee defense, nothing great there, but these things just crush through enemy armored units like nothing else in the game. Their armor isn't that great, and their defensive statistics aren't amazing, however, meaning that if they're not fighting heavily armored units like Black Orcs or Chosen or Empire Greatswords, they're not necessarily going to do all that well, and they're certainly not going to make their money back. Lastly, you've got the Ironbreakers, and these guys have a charge bonus against everything, unlike most dwarf units without great weapons. They don't have the most damage in the game, and they don't have armor-piercing damage very high, but they have got these explosive charges, same as the Dwarven Miners, and they've got 2 ammunition on that, which makes them quite effective at that role. And their melee defense is so high that they can actually fight things like Black Orcs and not take that much damage, because they'll block the damage from those guys quite consistently. Their armor value is absolutely huge, and they've got a decent block chance against missiles as well, making them very resilient against everything in the game, essentially. These guys are very, very tough to kill. Like, I've had these guys tanking out things like Grimgore for extended periods of time, and actually doing a fairly decent job of holding him up for a long period of time. Their killing power being low is their only real downside, but if they can get off all their missiles, the enemy's going to be softened up to the point where they can actually end up winning against units that theoretically counter them, like Great Swords or Black Orcs. They are the most expensive infantry unit for the Dwarves, however, at 1,300, but they're almost always worth that value. The only problem is that, you can't build a full line of them just because they do cost too much to build your whole battle line around, and they don't kill the enemy fast enough. So if the enemy does just tie them up with cheapo units, you can get surrounded and eventually killed if you take nothing but Ironbreakers, so it's not really a great mainline unit. But holding a critical point of the battle, always go with Ironbreakers if you can. Next up, you've got the Missile Infantry. You start off with the Quarreler, and these guys are the best counter to ranged units in the game in an archer versus archer fight. They've got good range damage statistics, sort of the normal that you would expect in this game, but they've got really decent weapon strength and so on and so forth, making them hard to kill. They've also got very high armor and shields, which is unique amongst missile units, making them really hard to kill with a ranged unit. So if they're up against, say, Bretonnian peasant archers or whatever, these guys are going to tank that archer fire very, very effectively, and they're going to be able to retaliate in kind and easily beat those Bretonnian archers without too much difficulty, making them a very, very strong ranged unit. Their damage being good is also one of those things that really helps out, because they're just going to be able to do like high damage to opponents, which is something that a lot of Dwarven lines lack. They don't really have huge damage dealers, and if they do, those are kind of situational or weak in certain contexts. So if you tank out the enemy and use Quarrelers, they're a really good choice. Next up, they've got Quarrelers with great weapons. This just adds armor piercing to their melee attack, but also gets rid of their shields. I actually think this is a downgrade that you pay for, because the shields makes them better at the role that they fulfill, and you should not be putting your ranged units into melee against armor-piercing elite troops. They're just going to still lose, and it doesn't really add much to their capabilities otherwise. I don't really think this is a very good upgrade. In fact, I think that this should be cheaper than the base Coralers. I think this should be like worth 525 because it's such a bad downgrade to lose the shields on those guys. Next up, you've got the Thunderers. This is what you would actually take for a ranged unit if your opponent has lots of armored units. This gives them an armor-piercing ranged attack. As you can see, it's not that much damage, but it is pretty decent damage, and a lot of it being armor-piercing really does help. The range is a little bit shorter, meaning these guys are a little bit worse at skirmishing, but if you can fire off some shots, these guys can do really well. They'll beat things like Imperial handgunners as well because of their shields, and they can tank through some arrow fire despite their shorter range because of the shield bonus and high armor values. Honestly, I tend to prefer Coralers just because in most contexts they'll deal more damage, but Thunderers are what you would take if you need to crack through armor. Next up, they've got the Iron Drakes. These guys I find very situational. Very rarely will your enemy sit in front of them long enough for you to actually squirt out enough fire to make their points back, but they have got a very devastating ranged attack at unfortunately short range, which is what makes them hard to use. Now, their small unit size and relatively low values, despite their high armor, means that they go down very quickly. So these guys are too fragile and too short range to really make their points back. I've yet to find a really good situation to use those. The Iron Drakes with the Troll Hammer torpedoes, on the other hand, I found can be quite useful in bursting down enemy monster type units very quickly, dealing huge amounts of damage to them in one go. They take a long time to reload, however, meaning that if your opponent has multiple units of monstrous type units, they're not going to be able to do much by themselves. You do still need a lot of other units for the Dwarven army to really fight against that kind of stuff, but they can be effective at dealing that damage. Next up, we've got the Artillery and War Machines, and we're just going to clear out some of this stuff here. So first off, you've got the Gyrocopters. Now, the Gyrocopters have the ability to drop bombs, but they've also got a ranged gun attack. Now, the ranged gun attack, since you've only got 3 Gyrocopters, is actually quite poor. You can think of this as being equivalent to, like, 3 of your crossbowmen. That's actually quite bad, and it's at short range, meaning that if your opponent has ranged units, Gyrocopters can't really get used in that context. They're quite fragile despite their statistics because there's only 3 of them with a low health pool. So these things I think are not particularly good. I don't tend to use those for anything in particular. Grudge Thrower, it's a 750 point artillery piece, good range, decent missile damage, although lower even than the Field Trebuchet for the Bretonnians, and it costs a little bit more. It does have slightly higher resilience though, so that could be why that is. And it's a relatively okay catapult, it's what you would expect it to be, but the cannon only costs 50 more, and it's a much better siege engine, so if you're going to take something, take the cannon. I find it much more effective under more circumstances. Gyrocopter with a Brimstone gun has an armor-piercing variant of the gun, and it's actually a very high damaging weapon, so it's actually kind of useful for sniping at elite units, but even then I don't particularly find this to be a great vessel. It does still have the bombs, which can be useful in certain situations as well, but honestly there are very few times where I feel compelled to take the Gyrocopters. Next up, you got the Organ Gun. The Organ Gun is an extremely potent siege weapon. It's got decent range, it's got good ammunition, and it does a lot of damage per shot, firing off 4 of these shots per volley, and with a fairly high rate of fire as well, making these quite good. These things just tear through elite infantry and cavalry very effectively because the missile will pass through them and deal huge damage to each unit in the line. So this can be very deadly if your opponent is advancing, or even if they're sort of standing still trying to outskirmish you for a second there. This can just really turn the tide of one of those fights by killing like an entire line of Black Orcs in a good volley or something like that. It is a little bit expensive though, and it is a little bit situational, so if you're going to get rushed too heavily, it might not be that useful. Next up, we got the Gyro Bomber, very expensive, very high-powered gun, theoretically. The problem is it's only got 1 in the unit. So technically, the Brimstone gun actually deals more damage, since there's 3 of them. That's actually about 300, it's 297, compared to the 223 armor piercing that you get on the Gyro Bomber. So realistically, you're going to want to use something other than the Gyro Bomber for taking out pretty much anything. It does have a huge amount of damage, and it does have a lot of bombs, but again, you get 6 bombs if you're using the Gyrocopters with the Brimstone gun. You get 11 if you're using this one, so you might as well take 2 of the Gyrocopters if you really felt you needed those bombs or whatever, because the bomber just costs more and isn't really any more effective. In fact, it's less effective in many regards. So I think that this is one of the ones that, like, they should have just given them 3 of them in the unit and downscaled their damage just a little bit or something like that. Not sure what they could have done. Anyway, next up you've got the Flame Cannon. This runs into the same problem as the Iron Drakes. It just doesn't do enough to justify what it costs. Most people are not going to stand in its relatively short range of 150. Now, this could actually be used, though, to squirt fire at archers as the enemy approaches. They'll usually have their archers staying behind, and this gives you long periods of time that you can fire at them with the flame cannon. Could be useful in that sense, but still I find that it's much more useful to just not take the flame cannon, take quarrelers instead, who can do that job just as well for a lot less. So, for artillery, I think the cannon and the organ gun are pretty okay, but everything else is a little bit funny. It doesn't really work out quite as well as I would like it to. Anyway, let's go ahead and head into battles here. See what we can get. Now, when you're playing as the Dwarves, you can expect your opponent is definitely going to take those armor-piercing units. Whether it be the Cryptors for the Undead, whether it be the Greatswords in the Empire, whether it be Black Orcs for the Orcs and Goblins, the Greenskins rather. Those sort of units are guaranteed against the Dwarves just because the enemy is going to know that they're going to need them against you. So you can sort of guess what they're going to have, and depending on what that is, you'll know how much armor penetration you'll need against them, as well as what sort of units are going to be quite good. So let's go ahead and pick Dwarves here. It's going to be Dwarf versus Dwarf, it looks like. So we're going to go ahead and pick Ungrim Iron Fist. Actually, no, we'll pick a generic Lord. I don't think we need Ungrim against Dwarves. And we'll go ahead and start picking up our army. We don't actually need Dwarf Warriors in this particular case. So we'll take a good number of Longbeards with the Great Weapons here. We'll go ahead and take a couple of the Iron Breakers, since even against Dwarves they're quite effective. We'll go ahead and still take Quarrelers. I don't want to have to get outranged that badly. And we'll go ahead and load up on Cannon. What can we get rid of? Actually, let's not take Iron Breakers. Let's take... We take Hammerers, maybe? Nah, let's not even take that. Let's take some Dwarf Warriors with Great Weapons. I don't particularly think they're amazing, but against Dwarves they can actually be quite effective. So, for them, like, lots and lots of artillery. The thing is that, like, it's going to come down to which of us can sort of force the other Dwarf forward, which is kind of a dumb thing, but that is sort of the way that is going to be here. You know, I could actually... Let's get rid of all of those upgrades there. Let's get rid of one of these. Let's get rid of another one of these, and let's take the Master Engineer. I think that ought to be a good choice there. And I guess we could get rid of one of these for another unit of Longbeards with Great Weapons. Now, my opponent could just be faking me out and end up taking a lot of Slayers, but, you know, not going to worry too much about that. Alright, so looks like my opponent has regular Longbeards, which is an interesting choice against Dwarves. They don't particularly have great armor-piercing damage, so it's going to be a little bit trickier for them to beat my units that have great weapons. Although they're still a very good solid unit, and they're a little bit cheaper than mine, so we'll see how that goes. Yeah, I don't know why my throat is so sore, but it is. Alright. So, nice thing about two cannons is the amount of range that they've got, of course. I'm going to go ahead and put them sort of right up here. Know that my opponent can't just easily rush them. Let's go ahead and put our organ guns right there. And I don't really want to have my units sort of in a deep formation, because my opponent is likely to have his own guns lined up against me. So we're going to go ahead and put our engineer over here by the cannons and stuff like that. And we'll go ahead and put our general over on the flank to guard this thing here. Alright, so let's go ahead and hit start battle. See what our opponent is going to be up to. Now, if I were my opponent, I might hide something in this forest over here. Let's go ahead and do that. Now, what we're going to want to do is see what our opponent has, and depending on what he has, contract our lines if he doesn't have very much artillery, because we'll know that he's going to come and rush towards us. But if he does have lots of artillery, we'll have to figure out how to beat his artillery with ours. Alright, let's make sure that we are in range of our stuff here. I'm pretty sure that's 30 range. Yeah, that should reach all my artillery. Now, won't reach my crossbowmen, unfortunately, but that's okay. One problem is I do have to wait a little while before my ballistics calibration can be used, kicked in. It'd be nice if I could also get extra range on that. That'd be pleasant. Alright, let's see what my opponent's done here. He's got a bunch of gyrocopters for some reason. Alright, interesting. He's got a runesmith. Is that an organ gun? Yeah, that's an organ gun. Now, my opponent doesn't actually have all that much in the way of missile units, so it might be a good idea for me to contract my lines just a little bit. He's got, for some reason, a bunch of gyrocopters as well, which is a little bit peculiar. Alright, let's fire at these longbeards up front, I suppose. Got Great Axe Infantry. Is that Ungrim? I think that's Ungrim. Yeah, it is. So he's going to be a little bit tough to deal with for me, but that's okay. He's got his lines stretched out quite smartly, so he's going to have a relatively easy time avoiding some of the worst of the damage from my cannons there. Let's try hitting these things here. Alright, organ gun's starting to fire. Going to be quite okay at this. Let's start firing our ranged units at these gyrocopters here. Taking quite heavy damage already. We'll move back with our troops there. And we'll get ready to fire at the gunners in a second, but what are these on the flank there? Those are hammers, so those are going to be trouble for me. Let's get our general near there. Oh, I think I only affected one cannon actually with that. Shit. Alright, let's get these guys sort of back. Move back with these guys. Get these cannons to fire at these gunners over there if we can. Alright, let's get into this fight over here because we'll be outmatched pretty badly by those hammers if we don't. Ooh, yeah, we're already getting outmatched pretty badly by those hammers. Get some fire down there. Alright, let's get you firing at these guys. Alright, let's upgrade our troops over in this flank. Try and wipe out these hammers relatively quickly. Looks like he's coming in for a bombing run against me, but that's okay. We're winning decisively on a lot of locations because our units are much, much better at dealing damage to armored units. Alright, and it seems like we're doing okay, although that organ gun is starting to be a real pain. Let's go ahead and fire at it. Lord is under attack, although we've broken through those hammers thanks to the support of our general. And our general should go ahead and start attacking that rune priest, because he's going to otherwise be a real pain to me. Now, my opponent has started losing on a lot of fronts here. Let's attack these longbeards here. Now, Ungrim is vicious enough that he's going to be really a problem for my longbeards here, but you can see that we've dealt some damage to him. Hopefully that'll be okay. Alright, everything's going over here. Let's get you guys over towards that organ gun, maybe. Start firing at this gyro bomber, maybe, I don't know. General. Wanting to kill these guys faster. In particular, we want to hit that runesmith. So Ungrim has freed himself. Gonna want to run away with these ranged units a bit. Fire at these guys over here. Get my general to buff the units that he's near. I think I should be able to get into these organ guns with one of my units relatively intact, so we'll see how that goes. Let's fire at these thunderers here, I guess. Or we'll try and get rid of this one that's on low hit points first. Alright, so we've taken out that rune priest. Let's start fighting these longbeards. They're not very effective against my lord here, so I can do this fight pretty effectively. Try and get into that organ, or that whatever it is. Fire at these thunderers that are trying to get around my flank there. Alright, we'll switch over to this one now that those ones are running. We'll start firing at Ungrim over there if we can, as well. Oh, it looks like their priest has recovered a little bit. Alright. See if we can hit this thing. They've lost their Longbeard, so it is now just Great Axe infantry all piling into Ungrim, which is fine by me. Thunderers over here. Again, theoretically, they beat my guys because of the armor penetration, but that's not always the case. Alright, those Brimstone Gyrocopters are still out there doing their thing. We're trying to poke and pick at their general with our engineer. He does actually decent damage against him, so it's actually a kind of funny thing that you can do is just focus fire. Oh yeah, no, he's withdrawn. Okay, so here was one of those cases of like, I knew what my opponent was going to have. I knew he was going to have lots of armor, so I took all armor penetrating stuff. The Quarrelers I took because they're just a superior damage unit in my opinion compared to the Thunderers for their cost value. The Hammers that he took did a pretty decent job actually, but then they got cleared off pretty okay. And yeah, just all in all, I think that we're not going to do this right now. I think all in all the Dwarves have a pretty decent roster. They're pretty good at dealing with a lot of things, but they're weak against people assassinating their generals since they can't really retaliate against that. And they have a little bit of trouble with the amount of armor penetrating units that people tend to take nowadays. A lot of them are quite cost effective as well, so it makes it a little bit harder for the Dwarves to deal with it, and their lack of mobility hurts them as well. So the Dwarves do have some weaknesses, but I think that their sort of reliability and the strength of their infantry sort of can carry them through a lot of battles that they might otherwise lose. In particular, I think that the Longbeards are just a very, very cost-effective, very high-tier unit with extremely good statistics that make them hard to deal with. Ironbreakers, same sort of story. Quarrelers, best ranged unit in the game, hands down. And their artillery is actually pretty decent. You'll tend to do quite well with things like the cannons. The organ gun can do well circumstantially. I just find that the gyrocopters don't really get their points back necessarily. So anyway, I hope you found this video enjoyable, and of course, as always, I hope to see you all next time.